This is Gary Zacharias, and you're listening to the Apologist Bookshelf. I have a new book for you, not literally brand new, but new as far as podcasts go. This book is actually going to be 20 years old in another few months. It's by Rodney Stark. It's called The Victory of Reason, How Christianity Led to Freedom, Capitalism, and Western Success. Now, I love that subtitle because we're hearing today so many people complaining that Christianity, for example, was anti-science and that it held back all sorts of things that we love today, and it's really not true. The Wall Street Journal says this, it calls the book a tour de force, a fun book to read full of anecdote and incident, delights as well as instructs. And so what the author is doing, his name is Rodney Stark again, he's kind of bringing up a viewpoint that was around for a long time and then got dumped for this modern skeptical view of how bad Christianity is. But Stark is saying that Christianity and its related institutions are really primarily responsible for the best of our intellectual, political, scientific, and economic breakthroughs of the past 1,000 years. He says Christian theology is the very font of reason. That's why he calls it the victory of reason. He says Christianity alone embraced logic and deductive thinking as a way forward to things like enlightenment and freedom and progress. And so this is a survey book. It's not that long. I'm looking up here. It's lots of bibliography. Okay, here we go. 235 pages. So it's not that long, but it's really, really good. It's talks about scientific progress, democratic rule, free commerce. And again, underline this part, he says all of these things are due to Christianity. We inherited it. And the sad thing, I think, is that we have all these things today and we take them for granted and we act as if this all just happened in a vacuum. It's not true. It's the Christian background that brought this about. So George Weigel, who's a professor, says it's a bracing antidote to the secularist smog that chokes education today. Good comment. All right, so I want to look at Chapter 2, and it's called Medieval Progress, Technical, Cultural, and Religious. So he's doing a lot of things in this chapter. He said, here's the story. Here's what we're being told these days. It says for about the past 2 or 3 centuries, this is what people have heard, that from the fall of Rome, so we're talking the 400 or 500 ADs, until about the 15th century, Europe had what was called the Dark Ages. And it was just full of ignorance and superstition and misery. And then, almost like a light going off, boom, suddenly, just miraculously, that period got rescued by the Renaissance and then the Enlightenment. Next sentence. But it didn't happen that way. He says instead, what we've got during these dark ages, he said European technology and science overtook and surpassed the rest of the world. Wow. Well, where'd this come from, this idea of the dark ages? He said it's a hoax, and it came out because of anti-religious and bitterly anti-Catholic 18th century intellectuals. They wanted to say, hey, we're superior. We don't buy into Catholicism or Christianity. And so they put down the time before. In fact, this is what Voltaire said. He talked about the Christian world after the fall of Rome. He said, barbarism, superstition, and ignorance covered the face of the world. He said that got repeated so many times. He said people are accepting this idea of a dark ages. By the way, it's good news, right? I said in the past few years, that view has been so discredited that even some dictionaries and encyclopedias are getting away from the idea of the Dark Ages. They're calling that view mythical. So it said this chapter, this book in Stark's view, he said what he's trying to do is to show that when the breakup of the Roman Empire came, it said it released people from oppression, and you ended up with new technologies. Said human effort and ingenuity turned to better ways to farm and to sail and to transport goods, to build churches, to make war, to educate, and even to play music. And isn't that interesting? We think of Greeks and Romans as kind of at the peak of civilization, and when they fell, the Dark Ages came. He said, no, actually, it released people to accomplish a lot. He said they were freed from the grip of tyrants. Stark says that Dark Ages saw an extraordinary outburst of innovation in technology and culture. There were new organizational administrative forms, the birth of capitalism. They said that period rejected prior doctrinal objections to profits and interest. So what about technology? He turns to that first. He said, when you have a despotic state, kind of like Rome was, right, tyranny, that discourages and even prevents progress. I mean, why should a farmer try to do something different in agriculture if the increased production would be taken away? Right? That makes sense. So what kinds of technical innovations were there? I'm going to go pretty quickly over these because he goes into detail that's really impressive. But I want to try to do this chapter, and there's a lot to it. So he said probably the greatest achievement of the Dark Ages was the innovation in production, right? The first economies that he said came about that depended primarily on non-human power. So they had water mills that came along. They had something called an overshot wheel. The water would come from a spillway and strike the top of the wheel and cause it to spin. They constructed large dams. Medieval Europeans harnessed the wind. They greatly increased horsepower, literally. They had a better collar for the horse. They had iron shoes for the horse's hooves. They came up with a better plow. The heavy-wheeled plow made the land more productive. Land that the Romans couldn't even farm at all suddenly became very productive. And it said even on thinner soil, crop yields were nearly doubled by better plowing. Now you say, well, where's he getting this stuff? Well, he's got footnotes to all of this. And you go back and you see just hundreds of books that he's used as this, and he tells you where he got all that specific information. Okay, so back to Stark. He said farmers grew fish. It was actual fish farming that they did in the Middle Ages. As far as coming up with more crops, what did they do? They adopted what they called a three-field system. So farmland was divided into three plots. One planted in a winter crop, like wheat. The second would be planted in a spring crop, like oats, legumes, and vegetables. And then the third was allowed to lie fallow. You wouldn't plant it. And then you'd rotate, right? So the next year, the one that was fallow would be planted with winter and so on. So they rotated. Cloth making was a big deal. It says medieval Europeans benefited from three inventions that helped them a lot. Chimneys. It said Roman buildings were pretty much unheated, but Europeans came up with chimneys, eyeglasses, and clocks. So you can imagine the things that they created there. He said we could list. He said these are just some of the innovations and inventions in these dark ages. He said others included improvements in cranes and hoists, mining, smelting, metalworking technology, improvement in seeds, even the invention of the wheelbarrow. All right, how about another thing that happened during this time period? Innovations in war. That's a shame, isn't it? We even have to talk about that as if we should be proud that we've got better ways to kill each other. But that is part of what happened during these dark ages. They weren't so dark. They improved things in war. The Franks in 732 came up with the first heavy cavalry. They had better saddles. They were high-backed and they were braced with stirrups. And gunnery was a lot better. The cannon came along this time. Breakthrough in terms of sea power. They had rudders at the stern. They were better at shipbuilding. They had superior firepower when it came to sea battles. They said maybe the best thing that they came up with as far as naval innovation was a round ship. They said galleys earlier than that were relatively flat-bottomed, but these were rounder. Then came the compass. Wow, that was a huge deal, huh? And it said it was all of these things are coming about. Now here's where he's going to back off and give us a big picture. All of these developments, he says, can be traced to the unique Christian convention that progress was a God-given obligation. Why? We had a gift of reason. God had given us our brains, our minds, and so we could do all these great things, very, very optimistic, very positive that we could accomplish things. And so this is not a society that was static. They felt progress was going somewhere. This is all because of Christianity. So he said many major technical innovations were made by monks and were adopted by great monastic estates, and they spread all over the place. Europe was not insular and immobile. Things spread quickly because of land transportation. So he goes into that next. He said what was called long-distance Roman trade wasn't really trade at all. It was just extraction, right? They just pulled out stuff from the people that they had conquered. But it says it wasn't until the Dark Ages that Europeans developed a way to have good long-distance overland transportation for heavy and bulky items. So you got wagons. Wagons had brakes. They had front axles that you could swivel. It was the medieval Europeans who invented harnesses and reins so that you could get a large number of horses lined up in columns, in pairs. What about progress in high culture? Well, music. It says, take a look at what the Romans and Greeks did. They played monophonic music, just a single musical line sounded by all the voices or instruments. It was the medieval musicians who invented what's called polyphony or polyphony. That's the sounding of two or more musical lines. That's harmonies. It said that was around, probably known by around the year 900. It was during the Dark Ages that the instruments that you need to exploit harmonies came about. So you got the pipe organ, the clavichord, the harpsichord, the violin, bass fiddle. You had a better system of musical notation got invented. How about the area of art? It says art historians now acknowledge that what was called Romanesque, right? That was, in other words, an imitation in a sense of what was Roman. But it says that architecture and sculpture and painting was actually very original. So in the 12th century, you had an even more original and striking era called the Gothic era, Gothic architecture and Gothic painting and all. Now, you've seen probably some of these huge Gothic cathedrals. They were able to create them due to flying buttresses, so they could build really tall buildings with thin walls and large windows. Artists in Northern Europe in the 13th century, they were the first to use oil paint, and they put their work on stretched canvas rather than wood or plaster. What about literature? Well, it says the vernacular prose was popularized. So you had people like Dante and Chaucer and others. He says so much for Dark Age illiteracy and ignorance. Then we turn to education. The university was founded by the church in the 12th century. It was new, devoted exclusively to higher learning. So this Christian invention was completely different from Chinese academies that trained mandarins. These new universities were not concerned with imparting received wisdom. They were innovative. It said faculty gained fame because of their innovations. The same early universities were the places where science was born. So he talks about science. He says, start with the Greeks. They assumed vacuums were impossible, and so therefore they said space was filled with transparent matter. And it wasn't until the Middle Ages that they said, no, space is a vacuum. Ideas of the Earth turning on its axis. In fact, he says so much progress took place in these dark ages that by no later than the 13th century, Europe had forged far ahead of Rome and Greece and ahead of the rest of the world as well. He said, why? And here it comes again, primarily because Christianity taught that progress was normal and that new inventions would always be forthcoming. He said that was a revolutionary idea. Everything was pretty static up until that time. Medieval Europeans they had the idea of developing better ways to get things done. And then here's another area, inventing capitalism. Capitalism evolved beginning in the 9th century by Catholic monks. They were trying to ensure the economic security of their monastic estates. Capitalism, they said, is kind of hard to define. He said the term came into use in the 14th century to identify funds that had the capacity to return income rather than just being used. So in the early usage, if you talked about capitalism, it referred to the use of wealth to earn wealth. So that's an interesting way to put it, isn't it? So capitalism implied using wealth to provide income. So it was investment. So capitalists tended to invest in productive activities where new wealth would be created. So capitalism also implied a degree of management, of somebody being a supervisor. And these activities involved planning and commercial complexity. So he finally gets around to what he says he thinks is a good definition for capitalism: an economic system wherein privately owned, relatively well-organized and stable firms pursue complex commercial activities within a relatively free, unregulated market, taking a systematic long-term approach to investing and reinvesting wealth in productive activities involving a hired workforce and guided by anticipated and actual returns. Now, I know that's a mouthful, but let me just go over it just real quickly. It's an economic system, okay? Privately owned firms, right? Private ownership, and they got to be organized, and they're pursuing complex activities, but it depends on having a free market, people keeping hands off, and they take a long-term approach to take their money and invest it in something that they think will bring money back to them. So that's capitalism. I think about that these days with people beginning to toy with the idea of Marxism or socialism. Capitalism has brought more people out of poverty than any other system. I mean, just think about Venezuela. It's had socialism, I guess, next door to communism for the last, 20 years or so. How's it doing? It's terrible. All right, well, anyway, so he said, one more time, he said, capitalism rests upon free markets, secure property rights, and free, uncoerced labor. Now, he said the Bible does condemn greed or wealth, but it doesn't condemn commerce or merchants. But unfortunately, the real early church fathers kind of bought into the Greco-Roman idea that commerce was a degrading activity. But by the fall of Rome, the attitude toward commerce began to mellow. Augustine, he gave legitimacy not just to merchants, but to the eventual involvement of the church in the birth of capitalism. And that came along about the 9th century. The monastic states that were there, they weren't limited just to enough agriculture to feed their own people. They began to specialize in particular crops and sold them at a profit. Then they could use that profit for what else they needed. So that initiated a cash economy. They began to also reinvest their profits to increase their productive capacity. They became banks. Many monasteries became banks. I didn't know that. They would lend money to the nobility. So it said many orders in those days, monastic orders, would reinvest their wealth in buying or reclaiming more land. And so there was rapid growth at that time. And as the productivity increased, so did specialization. So, for example, some estates just produced wine. Others would produce certain kinds of grain. Some would just raise cattle or sheep. Meanwhile, he says the rapid increase in surpluses encouraged the founding and growth of towns and cities. So when the states grew into small cities that had different outposts and all, he said 3 things came about. Good management, that was one thing. A shift from a barter to a cash economy was a second thing. And the third development was credit, to lend money at interest. So that began to happen as well. Monks became pretty well off, and great monasteries ended up doing hired labor. So I'm trying to see how much more I've got a couple of minutes here. I'll speed it up a little bit here, but this is an amazing chapter. There's so much here, isn't it? I said the traditional society at the time had put down the idea of work. That was a bad thing. But no, the idea that work is virtuous was new. It wasn't in Rome. So it said it was the Protestant ethic. You heard about that Protestant work ethic. That said, but virtues of work and simple living came along way before the Protestants, before Martin Luther. In fact, St. Benedict said idleness is the enemy of the soul. So I said it's very legitimate to link capitalism to a Christian ethic. So right around the 9th century, the monastic estates began to really grow. They started looking organized and they were stable. They were pursuing complex commercial activities within a free market because they expected returns. Okay, it said during the 12th and 13th century, there were some Christian theologians and all declared that profits were morally legitimate. So the church made its peace with early capitalism way before the Protestants, because Christianity at first had been opposed to any interest because that's what the Jews believed. So interest on loans came about. Writing in the 13th century, there was a St. Albertus Magnus. He proposed that just price is what goods are worth according to the estimation of the market at the time of sale. Sounds pretty up to date, doesn't it? So his point was that no later than the 13th century, leading Christian theologians had debated this whole issue of capitalism. Are profits okay? Should we have property rights? What about credit? What about lending? And said in each case he came up with generally favorable, approving views. He said that was a huge shift. So the church didn't stand in the way. It both justified and took an active role in creating this commercial revolution in the 12th and 13th centuries. All right, as he wraps up the chapter then, I like what he does at the end here. He talks about Islam, just to compare it to Christianity. The Quran condemns all interest on borrowed money. That's interesting. So there's a huge difference. Even today, banks exist in Islamic societies only by means of a huge, cumbersome workaround because they've got to get rid of that problem of there's a prohibition of interest. So he said religious opposition to interest combined with the avarice of all these repressive Islamic regimes have prevented capitalism from arising. And it still does, he said. And he ends up by saying victories of reason have yet to be won. He's talking about Islamic countries. So here's his summary of what he has to say. How do we get to these modern times? It didn't pop into existence during the Renaissance. He said Western civilization arose progressively over many centuries after the fall of Rome. So he said these so-called Dark Ages were a period of profound enlightenment in both material and intellectual spheres. He said combined with Christian doctrines of moral equality, it created a whole new world based on political and economic and personal freedom. So I hope you find that interesting. We have nothing to be ashamed of as Christians and what's happened in our past and how much we have made this world a better place. Well, good book called The Victory of Reason. Rodney Stark, interesting man. Thanks for being part of the podcast. Take care.